Lashed to a post and whipped bloody, a cowboy untied her and gave her tenderness. The rope had been tied by someone who knew knots and didn't care what they cut into. I know that because I spent 20 minutes working it loose in the dark, and my fingers were slick before I got the first coil free, and the blood wasn't mine. Her wrists were raw down to something that looked white in the lantern light, and I made myself not look away from it because she'd been looking at it alone for long enough without a witness. She didn't say anything when I got the second coil off. She didn't cry. She just stood there against the post, a fence post, rough-cut cedar, big around as a man's thigh, and breathed. That was all. Just breathed, like breathing was something she'd had to remind herself to keep doing. My name is Cal Prout. I was 53 years old that autumn, and I hadn't done much in the last 6 years that I'd want to tell a stranger. Drifted south from the territories after my outfit folded. Hired on with a string of outfits that never quite needed me as long as they said they did. Got lean. Got quiet. Got to where I could go a whole week without saying more than what was strictly required to make the day function. I'd come up into the Garnet Hills country looking for work with a man named Arlo Creech, who ran a gold camp above the timberline and needed a man who knew mules and didn't steal. I knew mules and I didn't steal, so that was about right. Creech's camp was a rough thing. 3 canvas tents, a sluice, a cook shed, and a stink that hit you a quarter-mile out downwind. Men who'd been up there too long got a specific kind of wrong about the eyes. Not mean exactly. More like they'd stopped organizing the world into things that mattered and things that didn't. I'd been there 11 days when I found her. It was just past 4 in the morning. I'd woken because my mule Hector, a brown Roman-nosed animal who had better judgment than most men I'd ridden with, had started making a low, sustained noise in his picket line, not a bray, more like a resonance in his chest, the kind of sound he made when something was wrong in a way he couldn't locate. I lay still for a while listening, then I got up. She was tied to the post at the edge of the camp, the one they used as a hitching post for visitors, and someone had taken a strap to her back. Her dress, a plain gray cotton thing, a Sunday dress that had been brought up here for reasons that made no sense, was torn open across the shoulders. She was conscious. She was looking at the dark line of the trees. I don't remember making any decision. I was just suddenly next to her with my knife out. Her name was Nora Holt. She was 22 years old. She'd come up to the Garnet camp because her father had sent for her by letter, a letter that said he was sick and needed her and she should come at once. The letter, she'd find out later, had been written by Creech. Her father was not sick. Her father didn't know she was there. She'd been brought up the mountain by a man named Doyle who she'd thought was a hired freighter, but who turned out to be something else entirely. I didn't know any of this at 4 in the morning. I just knew what I could see, which was enough. What I remember about cutting her loose is the cold. The night had dropped hard and the rope was stiff and her breath made a little cloud in the dark, and I could feel her trying not to tremble against the post, bracing herself, trying not to show me anything she didn't have to. She didn't know me. Far as she knew, I might be the next thing she had to survive. When the second coil came free, I said, very quietly, "I'm going to put my coat around you." She said, "All right." That was the first thing she said to me, "All right." 2 words with nothing wasted in them. I shrugged out of my canvas trail coat. It was heavy, smelled like horse and wood smoke, and I laid it around her shoulders without touching the places that were hurt. She drew it closed with her hands. I stood in front of her and looked at her face in the dark, or tried to. She had dark hair that had come loose. She had a cut above her left eye that had dried. I said, "Can you walk?" She said she thought so. I said, "My mule's on the picket line. We're going to go to him quiet." She said, "And then what?" I thought about it. I said, "And then we're going to go down the mountain." She looked at me for a moment. She asked me what my name was. I told her. She said, "Cal Prout, are you one of them?" I said no. She looked at me another long moment the way a person looks at an animal they aren't sure of yet. Then she nodded, one small motion of her head, and I turned, and she followed me, and Hector was standing there in the dark calm as a stone, as if he'd been waiting for exactly this. We went down the mountain in the dark, leading Hector on foot because the trail was too steep and narrow to ride safely without light, and I didn't want a lantern. It took us 3 hours to reach the flat. She didn't make a sound the whole way down, not once, even when the trail turned rocky and her dress caught on the brush, and she stumbled once and caught herself on a fir branch, and I turned, and she'd already steadied herself and just looked at me and kept walking. When we got to the flat, it was just coming gray in the east. That thin, cold light that doesn't commit to anything yet. There was a creek. I stopped at it and watered Hector, and she knelt at the edge and drank and washed her face, working at it carefully around the cut, and I stood back and let her have the privacy of it. Then she sat back on her heels and looked at the water, and she said, "You left your job." I said I supposed I did. She said, "You left your job, and you'll have to ride some distance to find another." I said that was generally how it worked. She was quiet a moment, then she said, "Why?" It wasn't quite a question, more like something she needed to put sound to. I thought about the right way to answer it. I don't think I've ever been a man who does a lot of explaining. You do a thing because it wants doing or you don't. But she'd asked, and she'd earned an answer, so I thought about it, and I said, "Because they had no right to you." She looked at me then over her shoulder from where she was kneeling at the creek. I don't know what she was looking for in my face. Whatever it was, I think she found a piece of it because she turned back to the water and was quiet again, and the quiet felt different, more settled. We rode down through the morning, her behind me on Hector, side-saddle fashion with my coat still around her, and her hands not holding me, just resting on her lap, keeping her balance on her own. The mountains came out of the dark slowly, first just shapes, then color, the high peaks going pink, and then gold while the valley was still in shadow. It was a pretty morning. The kind that has nothing to do with anything that happened the night before, which is both how mornings work and sometimes the only mercy available. By mid-morning we reached the town of Peavey, which wasn't much, a smelter, a trading post, a two-room hotel that also served as the stage office. I got Nora a room. I paid for it with most of what I had. The woman who ran the hotel, a heavy-set woman named Mrs. Fant, who took one look at Nora and another look at me and made her own assessment quickly, took Nora into a back room, and I didn't see her for the better part of 2 hours. I sat on the porch of the trading post and drank bad coffee and thought about what came next. I had $3.60. I had a mule and a saddle and a blanket roll. The nearest outfit that might need a hand was a day and a half south. Peavey was not a place that'd work for a man like me. I was on my second cup of bad coffee when Mrs. Fant came out and sat down in the chair beside me without being asked. She said, "She needs a doctor. I've done what I can, but there's damage that wants proper tending." I said I understood. She said, "The nearest doctor is at Harrow Station, 8 miles west." I said I'd get her there. Mrs. Fant looked at me. She was 60 or so, a wide, flat face, gray hair pulled back without ceremony. She had the look of a woman who'd buried at least one husband and raised children and done the accounting in her head every morning and wasn't surprised by much. She said, "You the man that brought her down?" I said yes. She said, "Those Creech men'll come looking." I said probably. She said, "You armed?" I said I had a rifle. She looked at me another moment. Then she went inside and came back with a shotgun and laid it across my lap. She said, "My late husband's, I don't use it. You look like a man who knows what to do with it." I didn't say thank you. That felt like the wrong size for what she'd done. I just set my hand on the stock and nodded at her, and she went back inside, and that was the whole of it. Nora came out an hour later. She was wearing different clothes, a dark wool skirt, a gray shirtwaist, something Mrs. Fant must have provided, and her hair was pinned back and her face was clean, and the cut above her eye had been washed and dressed with a strip of white cloth. She walked carefully, holding herself at a certain angle I understood. She sat down in the chair Mrs. Fant had vacated and looked out at the street, which was mainly just mud and one dog sleeping in the middle of it. She said, "She told me you're going to take me to the doctor at Harrow Station." I said yes. She said, "And then what?" Same question as before. Down the mountain in the dark, she'd asked it, and I'd given her the plan I had, which was one step. Now we were at the end of that step. I turned the coffee cup in my hands. I said, "I'll get you to your family if you've got family, or wherever you need to go." She said, "My father's in Harrow Station. That's why I know about the doctor there. I wrote to him after." She stopped. "After things clarified, he's coming. He'll be there by tomorrow." I said, "Good." She said, "After that you'll need work." I said I'd find some. She looked at the street. The dog in the mud had rolled over. She said, "My father has a ranch south of Harrow. It's not big. He's been short a hand since last spring." I turned that over. I said, "I don't want to be a thing you feel obliged to." She looked at me straight then. She had gray eyes. I could see them clearly now in the daylight, and they were steady, the steadiest thing about her that first day, steadier than her hands. She said, "I'm telling you there's work. I'm not in the habit of offering things I don't mean." I said I'd think on it. She said, "All right," and turned back to the street. It was the same 2 words she'd said when I'd offered her my coat. They had the same quality, nothing performed in them, nothing extra, just the plain shape of her meaning. We left for Harrow Station in the early afternoon. She rode Hector and I walked, leading him by the halter. She said she was fine to ride, and I believed her, but I wanted to be on the ground where I could move if I needed to. I had the rifle across my shoulder and the shotgun tied to the saddle behind her. She didn't ask about it. We were 3 miles out of Peavey when 2 riders came down off the ridge behind us. I didn't turn right away. I could hear them by their hooves on the hardpan, 2 horses moving fast, then pulling back when they saw me stop. I turned then, slow, and looked at them. One was Doyle, the man who'd brought her up. The other I didn't know, younger, with a new canvas coat and a dirty face. Doyle pulled up 20 yards away. He was a thick man, broad-chested, with a beard that came up almost to his cheekbones. He had the look of a man who was accustomed to a specific kind of transaction, one where he had the numbers and the other party didn't have much choice. He looked at Nora. He looked at me. He said, "That woman's got a debt at the Creech camp. You're interfering with a business arrangement." I said, "No, I'm not." He said, "I'm telling you." I said, "You're hearing me. She's not going back." He was quiet for a moment. The younger one shifted his horse. The horses were getting the smell of something and moving in place. Doyle said, "You know what Creech does to men that interfere." I said I had some idea. I could feel Nora behind me on Hector, very still, not making a sound. Doyle put his hand toward his belt. I had the rifle off my shoulder and the hammer back before he got there. I didn't raise it. I just held it at my side with the muzzle dropped 40 degrees, which was a position a man could adjust from very fast, and I looked at Doyle without any particular expression. I said, "The next thing you do is ride back the way you came." He sat there for a long moment. His horse moved under him. The younger one looked at Doyle and then looked at me, and something went through his eyes, some arithmetic. Doyle looked at the rifle. He looked at my face. Whatever he found there was apparently sufficient because he pulled his horse around without a word and went back up the ridge, and the younger one went with him, and that was all of it. No shots, no more words, just the sound of them going up through the rocks and then the silence coming back. I stood there until I couldn't hear them anymore. Then I put the hammer down and slung the rifle back over my shoulder and took Hector's halter again, and we walked. Nora didn't say anything for about a mile. Then she said, "You didn't flinch." I said I'd had occasion to learn that flinching doesn't help much. She said, "Were you afraid?" I thought about that. I said, "Some, less than you'd think." She was quiet another quarter mile. Then she said, "I was more afraid watching you face them than I was last night tied to that post." I looked up at her. She was looking straight ahead down the road. She said, "Last night I'd given up on things going right. When you don't expect anything, it gets simpler. But watching you stand there, she stopped. I wanted it to go right. I hadn't wanted anything in a day and a half, and then all at once I wanted it very much." I didn't say anything. There wasn't the right thing to say to that. We walked on. The afternoon light was getting long, going gold across the dry grass on either side of the road, the kind of light that makes everything look like it's been there forever. The doctor in Harrow Station was a small man named Heifer who took one look at Nora and closed the door of his office and kept it closed for an hour while I waited in the street. When he came out, he told me she'd be all right, that the damage was real but would heal, that she needed a week of rest and proper food and no riding. He looked at me and said, "She told me what you did." I said I just brought her down the mountain. He said, "That's what I mean." He looked at me another moment and then went back inside. Her father arrived the next morning on the early stage, a lean, sun-browned man named Emmett Holt with a white mustache and his daughter's same gray eyes. And when he saw Nora, he didn't say anything, just put his arms around her very carefully and stood there in the middle of the stage office with his eyes shut. I stood back by the door with my hat in my hands and gave them the distance of it. He came to find me after, while Nora was inside the hotel resting. He found me at the livery where I was tending Hector, and he stood in the doorway a moment looking at me, and then he came in and put out his hand, and I shook it. He said, "She told me what you did." I said the same thing I'd said to the doctor. Just brought her down the mountain. He said, don't do that. I looked at him. He said, don't make it small. A man who makes what he did small is either lying to you or lying to himself, and you don't strike me as either one. What you did was a hard thing done right in the dark when no one was watching. I want to say thank you for it, and I want you to let me. I held his eyes. I said, all right. He nodded. He said, Nora tells me you need work. I said I'd been making do. He said, that's not the same as work. I've got a small spread south of here. Got 1,200 head going into winter, and I'm short-handed, and the men I've got are young and don't know yet what they don't know. I need someone who knows what he's doing and doesn't need to be told twice. He paused. I'm not offering charity. I'm telling you, I need the kind of man you appear to be. I looked at Hector, who was pulling at the hay in his manger and paying me no attention. I said, I'll come take a look. Emmett Holt said, good enough. I stayed 4 years. I know that sounds like a jump, but that's how I remember it, the offer and then the years. And not much I need to account for in between, because they were good years, the good kind that don't require explaining. I worked Emmett spread through 2 winters and a drought and 1 bad spring when we lost 40 head to a sickness that came through the valley and hit everybody. And I did what needed doing and didn't complain about the parts that were hard, because that's not a useful expenditure of a man's attention. Nora healed. That took time. She was careful with the world for a good while after that fall, not broken, nothing like that, but careful the way a person is when they've recalibrated what they're willing to extend trust to. She worked in the house. She helped her father with the accounts, which she was good at. She was always civil to me, warm even, but there was a distance she kept, and I respected it because it was hers to keep. I didn't push. I wasn't sure what I wanted or if wanting was the right frame for it. I was just a hired man on her father's place, and she was his daughter, and the years went by the way years do when a person is working hard and sleeping honest. It was the 3rd winter that things changed, and they changed slow, the way things change when neither person is in a hurry about it. She started coming out to the barn in the evenings. At first it was practical things, a question about one of the horses, whether a particular animal was favoring a leg. Then it was less particular. She'd come out and brush the horse nearest the door, and we'd talk or not talk, and both were fine. She was easy to be quiet with. That's rarer than people think. One evening in February she said, do you ever think about leaving? I was mending a bridle by the tack lamp. I said, now and then. She said, what stops you? I turned that over. The bridle needed a new keeper strap, and I was working it through with a punch, and I kept at that while I thought about the honest answer. I said, I'm not sure there's somewhere better to be. She looked at the horse she was brushing. She said, that's a careful way to say something. I said, I'm a careful man. She looked at me then for a moment, the lamplight on her face and the cold draft coming under the barn door moving the flame. She said, I know you are. I've been grateful for it. I didn't say anything. She said, I've been trying to think of the right way to say this for a while. I'm not sure there is a right way, so I'm just going to say it plainly. She set down the brush. She turned to face me. You are a good man, Cal Prout. You are a good man, and the world has not done right by you, and I've watched you come out here every morning and work like the work itself is worth doing whether anyone notices or not, and I notice. I want you to know that. I've noticed everything. I held the bridle in my hands, and I looked at her, and I didn't say anything because there was a thing happening in my chest that was making my voice unreliable. She said, I'm not asking you for anything you don't want to give. I'm just telling you what I see. I said, Nora. She said, what? I said, I don't know the last time someone said that to me. She said what? I said that they saw me, that they'd looked and this was what they found. She was quiet for a moment. Then she came across the barn. It wasn't far, maybe 6 steps. The barn was not large. And she put her arms around me, careful, the way she was careful about everything, and her head went against my shoulder, and I put my arms around her and held on. The lamp made a little circle around us. Outside the barn the night was cold and clear, the kind of night where you can hear the frost working in the wood of the buildings, a soft creak and tick that means the temperature is dropping. Hector was in his stall 10 feet away making the slow, rhythmic sound of a sleeping animal. She stayed like that for a long time, not crying, not talking, just there with her arms around me and her head on my shoulder, and I held her and looked at the lamplight on the wall and I thought, this is what it was for, all of it. The cold mountain in the dark and the hard years before it and everything since. Not the hardship being worth it in some neat accounting. It doesn't work like that, and anyone who says it does is selling something. Just that this particular moment, this barn, this woman who had her arms around me by choice, by her own free choosing, was real and I was in it. That's a different thing, and it was enough, more than enough. We were married that spring. Small thing, Emmett, the doctor heifer who'd become something like a friend, Mrs. Fant, who rode 8 miles from Peavy in a borrowed buggy with a jar of her own put-up plum preserves as a gift, a couple of the hands. Preacher came from Harrow. It rained in the morning and cleared by noon, and the air afterward had that particular quality it gets sometimes in high country after a rain, washed and sharp and smelling of the pines. Emmett shook my hand and called me son, which was not a small thing for either of us, though we didn't make much of it. That night I sat on the porch after supper in the last of the light, and Nora came out and sat beside me, close, her shoulder against mine, and we looked at what there was to look at, the valley going dark, the mountains catching the last color in the sky, a hawk working the thermals above the far ridge, tipping and adjusting, easy in the air. She put her hand in mine. We sat like that. I don't have a speech about what that was. I don't have a lesson to give you. All I've got is that I had been a man that nobody much required for a long while, and then I was a man that this woman had looked at and chosen and held on to, and that is a different thing to be. I knew it then, I know it now. The hawk tipped over the ridge and was gone. Nora's hand was warm in mine. The last light left the mountains, and the first stars came out above them, one at a time, the way they always do, as if they've been there the whole time just waiting for the dark to make them visible. That's what I've got. That's the whole of it.